Today, I'd like to provide you with information and fundamentals of assessment. Prior to our March 16th mailing of our assessment notices, this will give you a bit of a foundation of what to expect. And once the notices are mailed, then we'll give you more information as far as the results of the assessment changes. So each year, a three-step process takes place to approve the budget, to determine assessments, and allocate the municipal tax revenue for all parcels in the city. Today we'll concentrate on the step 2, and on the last 5 slides there'll be a brief overview giving you an overview of step 3, taxation. The role of council and the role of the assessor in regards to assessment. When we look at the Municipal Government Act under Part 9 for the assessment of property, which starts about Section 284 of the Municipal Government Act, we see that council can divide assessment classes into Class 1 residential into multiple unlimited number of subclasses. Currently, we have 2 classes for single family and multifamily. Class 2 non-residential it's a bit more limited as far as splitting that class, whether it be into vacant non-residential, small business, or other non-residential. We ask that council direct ratepayers with inquiries to the assessment department if they've got questions about their assessment, and that the assessor is to follow those best practices when preparing the assessment. Municipal Government Act Section 294, after giving reasonable notice, the assessor has the right to enter on, inspect property, and request anything to be produced. The next section, 295, the property owner has the duty to provide the information, and no one may make a complaint in the following year if they've not provided their requested information. So by February 28th, the assessor must prepare the assessment roll, so our staff is busy working on finalizing the assessments, and then we'll be sending out the assessment notices shortly. What is an assessor? Most cities employ their own assessors. Smaller municipalities hire private companies to complete their assessments since the province privatized in 1995. I am the designated assessor appointed for the city, and it's been almost 35 years that I've been doing it, so I love the assessment field. I'm an accredited municipal assessor of Alberta with the AMAA designation, and we have 4 other individuals in our office. We've got 14 office staff with the assessment department, and which includes also trainees and 2 part-time admin supports. Ad valorem is a Latin term for according to value. So the ability to pay is determined by the property wealth. The process, the assessor assigns a dollar value to each property for the purpose of property taxation, and that dollar value may be either market value or regulated value. So it's a yearly update to our assessment values, and that ensures a fair distribution of our property tax burden. There are 4 assessment classes that the assessor must assign to each property, and there may be some properties where there are more than 1 class that's assigned to the property. Class 1 residential has been split by City Council into 2 separate categories, single family and multifamily, being 5 units or more. Non-residential, which are commercial industrial properties, farmland, and machinery and equipment. When assigning the value to a property, the methods to be used are market value regulated. So I'd like to just define each of those. Market value, what is important there is that it is to be sold on the on the open market by willing seller, willing buyer. So the most likely sale price, and that definition comes out of the Municipal Government Act. When we look at the definition of property, it could be either land and improvement or land and improvement. Sometimes there's some confusion with the term improvement, but we take the definition out of the Municipal Government Act, and improvement means a structure, anything attached or secured to a structure. And a lot of individuals might think, well, I haven't done any improvements to my property, why am I getting this notice? But improvement is really defining the structure. A structure definition is a building or other thing erected on or placed in, under, over, or under land, whether or not it's affixed to the land. So that could really mean a lot of different structures that are within the property, not just what you see on the surface. Regulated value, market value is determined by the assessor, and regulated value is determined by the province. And those property types using regulated rates are farmland, railway, machinery equipment, and linear. These types of properties may not transfer very often, making that market value standard very difficult. But the province, what we've found is that the province has not updated these regulated rates for several years, thus creating a gap between the regulated value and the market value, so they do not equal one another. Designated industrial properties, since 2018, the province has taken over the responsibility of doing those calculations. That includes linear property, and linear property would include electric power systems, street lighting, telecommunication pipelines, wells. Railway, and also the province also takes over major plant defining of that value as well. Farmland, using regulated rates. For irrigated farmland, $450 per acre, non-irrigated $350, and then it's multiplied by a production value for that parcel. When we look at farm residence, we do have to split out 3 acres of land must be assessed at market value. If farmland is situated adjacent to servicing, then 3 acres of that land is also assessed at market value at its highest and best use. So as a result, we find significantly lower values with regulated rates than our market value. And when we're looking at farmland, it is a yearly review to make sure that they do meet the farming operation regulations or criteria. Just an example of farmland that is adjacent to servicing. So the first 3 acres zoned as highway commercial has a value of 1.294 million times the mill rate, 24,000, just over 24,000 per year for the taxes. The remaining 24 acres at farmland, the value, assessed value is $3,800 times the mill rate, equaling $72 in taxes. So you can see between the two, there's quite a discrepancy. We've talked about who is the assessor, how we do assessments, what is to be assessed. So not all property is assessable. Some property examples that we do not place a value would be roads, bridges, canals, ditches, water treatment plants, and farm buildings. In the rural community, they were 100% not assessed. 5 years ago in 2018 or 2017, they were at 50% taxable. Starting with the year 2018, that began to be phased out. So today in 2022, farm buildings will have a 0 assessment. Once we determine that a property is assessable, then we look at whether it's taxable or exempt. Some examples of exempt properties under the MGA, Municipal Government Act, are schools, churches, hospitals, nursing homes, municipally owned properties, or the Crown. A nonprofit organization that does meet the criteria under the Community Organization Property Tax Exemption Regulation will also be exempt, and that is based on an application process which we review every 4 years. Some properties may be accessible but exempt from taxation. So while other properties may be simply non-assessable. So we may have one property, such as some churches that have taxable areas that are used by daycares that we do tax based on the area that they're occupying. What are the standards that are used when assessments are prepared? Our property assessments that are based on market value must be prepared using mass appraisal, and I'll define that in the next slide. The estimate of fee simple, which means the unrestricted ownership, where the owner has complete control of the property. And when we're looking at typical market conditions, typical really means the midpoint or the median. So it may not necessarily be the exact sale price of that property that is transacted. Mass appraisal is the process of preparing assessments for a group of properties using standard methods and common data and allowing for statistical testing. That allows the assessor to accurately value a large number of properties in a short period of time, which can be a challenge in years if we're looking at market value based on sales. If we have a low number of sales, that does become a challenge. We're using 3 years of data to bring all our assessments to a common valuation date. So that lends into the two key legislated dates for assessment processes. The valuation date is based on July 1st of the assessment year. So assessment year is the year prior to taxation year. So for example, 2022 is our taxation year and our assessment valuation base will be July 1st, 2021. The condition date will be the end of the year, of the assessment year, so December 31st, 2021 for this taxation year. So assessors will review permits at year end for the condition and characteristics of the properties. So so even unfinished construction is assessed. How are assessments prepared? We use 3 approaches when evaluating market value, and I'll explain a little bit of each of one of those. The cost approach, that's a little less than 1% of our properties, about 200 properties, and those that are unique and do not sell often. The sales comparison approach is used for the majority of our properties, residential, so that's about 93% of our properties. The income approach for multifamily, commercial, industrial properties totals about 6% of our properties. The cost approach relates to the value of a property, to the cost of construction. And we do have a costing manual that we use, which is called Marshall & Swift. Under this approach, the assessor will determine the market value for the land and then add in the cost of the building improvements, less depreciation. So as I mentioned, even those properties that are under construction and not fully complete will still be assessed, and the cost approach is a reliable value when looking at new or new improvements. So the next slide is an example of the cost approach. The assessor, this slide here is done by the assessor through our Camelot costing assessment cost system. The first section is the market land details, so based on the size, zoning, location, any new positive factors, negative or positive factors that would be applied to the land for a total of $237,400. Next is the costing from the Marshall & Swift, and just wanted to direct your attention to the description. It's a gas bar with a canopy, booth, pumps, and tanks. So based on that description of structure that I had read earlier, that it could be on or under, in this case we do assess the pumps and the canopy and the booth that is on the land, and under would be underground tanks for the fueling, fuel storage. The sales comparison approach used for the majority of our properties relates to the sale price of other comparable properties. So when we're looking at properties similar to one another, adjustments will be made to the sale price for comparable properties to bring them more in line with those other properties when being assessed. So this works well for condominium properties as well as residential. For residential, we do a hybrid of both the cost and the sales comparison approach. So we're looking at placing residential properties into models, qualities, and structure types. And it's used by the majority of municipalities in the province, including City of Medicine Hat. So under this approach, all the improvements are first based on the cost approach. We look at grouping these properties together based on age, construction type, size, location, and then adjusting each based on whatever factors are actually physically within that property. So next, this is a sample where the market land valuation based on a 7,000 square foot lot, 155,500, and then next the improvement valuation for a 2,400 square foot house built 2002, and then a garage based on the square footage, same year built for a total. So that just gives a brief summary of the assessment. The next slide will have more of the components within the home: air conditioning, plumbing, cathedral ceiling, decks, basement finish, and any interior finishing within the garage. And the next slide is a sketch of the property. So it's just a brief example of when a property owner comes into the assessment department, we will give them a description of the details, summary of their property, so that they can verify whether the information is correct. The third approach, based on the income approach for our multifamily and non-residential properties, is based on the value of the property reflecting the quality and quantity of the income. So we're not looking at the business income. This is looking at the real estate income only for the building and the land. So each year, the assessor collects the leasing information, and that's done through an assessment request for information, or ARFI, if you've heard that term used before. And that is sent out yearly to the property owner. The assessor places properties of similar groupings based on type, location, age, size, and assigns a market rent. So once they've assigned that market rent to the property, then they use other standardized deductions for vacancy, collection losses, operating cost expenses to create a net operating income. Then we do divide that by the cap rate, which the capitalization rate is calculated by using 3 years of sales. And for the 2022 tax year, July 2018 to June 30th, 2021, is the time frame that we'll be using when we're converting that income into an expression of value. So we do model separately for commercial, industrial, and multifamily properties when we look at those sales separately. An example of an income approach property, you'll see that under the tenant description, there's a basement description of the basement at 1,313 square feet with a rate, and 2 office general on the main floor, one being 5,800 square feet, and the other being 5,100 square feet. So those total up to the potential gross income less the vacancy allowance. In this case, it is a downtown property office, and when we do the vacancy analysis, we do have our assessors drive by all the inventory each year, so that vacancy is calculated on what is actually happening in our city. It's not based on any other city in the province. So in this case, it's a 15% deduction. The operating cost adjustment for what the property owner would incur to maintain their income stream, less the non-recoverables, being expenses that are also incurred by the property owner, and reserves for replacements, which are also could be termed as structural allowances, typical amount that's set aside for the property capital for replacement. And then finally, the capitalization rate of 7% to calculate the final assessed value of $2,524,500. You also see on the bottom left-hand side that this property has an exempt portion. So part of this property is occupied by a nonprofit or a municipal operation, so that part of this is exempt. Once we prepare the evaluations, before sending them out in the mail, the assessments are all sent to the province, and the province does monitor our assessments to ensure that we meet their quality standards. So that has to be met before we can actually declare our assessments by February 28th. So we're right in that process during this time, finalizing our assessments. The assessment to sales ratio tests are conducted to determine whether assessment values meet regulated or legislated quality standards. So those quality standards are, if we're at 100% of market, we must be within plus or minus 5%. Once our assessments are delivered to the province, plus our sales, and those ratios are determined. There have been a few years where we have not been able to meet the February 28th declaration date, and some of the reasonings for that have been the flood of 2013, a review of non-residential properties, if staff shortage has been a challenge, retirements, or conversion of new assessment systems. So there's been about 4 years that we have then asked the province to provide us with an extension. If you have a property owner that that does not agree with their assessment, what do they do? We ask that you provide them with information to contact the department. Once they contact our department, they can request their assessment summary details. If they have another property that is comparable, we can also provide that information, providing that they have provided the address and a fee. We ask that they dialogue with the assessor, and if they're still not happy with the explanation, they cannot come to an agreement. There is another step. The property owner does have a legal right to appeal their assessment. The Assessment Review Board is an impartial tribunal that hears complaints from the property owner, and the arguments for both sides are written and submitted beforehand to both parties prior to the hearing. So 60 days, the property owner has a chance to review their assessment notice, and it's clearly marked on their assessment notice what that complaint deadline is. There's 2 levels of appeal. The Local Assessment Review Board with 3 dwellings or more, or the Composite Assessment Review Board. So the fee for the LARB, Local Assessment Review Board, is $50, and for all other properties, it's $650. But there is a reduced fee if the property owner files that fee within the first month of receiving their notice. The Assessment Review Board must dismiss a late complaint and must not alter an assessment that has been, that is fair and equitable. They will look at the valuation standards that are set out in the regulations and the legislation, and look at the assessments of similar property within the municipality. If they do not agree with that decision that comes from the Assessment Review Board, the next level is an appeal to the Court of Queen's Bench. A second tax and assessment notice, a supplementary notice, will be sent out during the year for new construction that is complete or occupied during the year. So since 2006, the City Council has passed a bylaw for supplementary assessments, and this provides additional revenue for the city. It also ensures fair treatment of all new construction to be assessed once complete. An example of a supplementary notice is if at the end of the year for our condition date, December 31st, the land is vacant, the assessor places an assessment value, we'll say $100,000 in this case, times the single-family tax rate. So that annual bill would have been $942 last year, as an example. If new construction is started February 1st and then completed by the end of July, then the supplementary value is set at the full value of the property, $500,000, and then less $100,000 being the annual notice for a supplementary total of $400,000. It's then multiplied by the tax rate and then times the number of months, prorated for 5 months in this case, from August to December. So the supplementary notices are sent in October for all properties that are new construction that are complete or occupied during the year, and prorated. So if you're all still awake after going through assessment basis, you can see that during the assessment cycle there are many factors that the department will go through. So the cycle, we're at the top here, February 28th, that signifies the end of the assessment year. So once that if we call that the starting point, it's when the assessment notices are mailed out, and there's a 60-day appeal period. Next, the tax notices are mailed out in May, towards the end of May, and due by the end of June. Soon after that, the assessors are already working on the next year valuation and preparing for the supplementary assessment notices that go out. So they'll do annual and supplementary inspections. So they're looking at all new permits, whether it be new construction or demolitions. In September, we're finalizing our sales information. So if we're based on market value, we receive information from Alberta Land Titles to our tax and assessment system. We send out what's called a sales verification form to new owners of property to verify whether or not the transaction was a valid transaction or non-arm's length. And then we're only using those that are valid sales to determine our assessment values. Into the fall, our appeal hearings will occur. Next, we'll work on the land valuation and then finalizing our inspections in December. And then we start with our modeling or doing our market analysis for our property valuation. And next, we'll load that data into ASSET, the provincial system, to verify that we've completed our assessments and met the standards. And then we can declare the roll and send out the notices and start all over again. So it's a quick yearly cycle for the assessor. So that kind of gives you just a brief overview of step 2, assessing of properties. Now step 3, as far as council, when they choose to distribute or how they distribute the tax. Taxation is really applying that tax rate or mill rate to the property's assessed value and to determine the amount of taxes payable by the owner. Property taxes being a major revenue source for governments, and the budget that has been approved at $80 million. So you'll see council has a greater role in terms of taxation under Part 10, which starts in the Municipal Government Act, Section 326. Passing a tax rate bylaw, council may cancel, reduce, or refund or defer taxes if they feel it equitable to do so. They also may make bylaws to make exempt property taxable under Section 363, whereas we have the college student dormitories that are taxable. Council may make machinery and equipment exempt from taxation, and as well full or partial exemptions for brownfield properties, so those that are contaminated, underutilized, or underdeveloped as a non-residential property. And the assessor will follow the regulations and legislation, provide the assessment base for setting of those tax rates, and make recommendations for tax rates. If we had one singular tax rate within the city, it would be a simple calculation of taking the 80 million divided by the taxable assessment, if it's 9 billion, to equal the mill rate. However, in this case, council has in the past decided that there be different rates for single-family, multifamily, non-residential properties, and farmland. So each of those, the assessor will appoint or put that property within each of the assessment classes, and then City Council will approve the bylaw based on those recommendations for tax rates. The next slide is just an example of our Schedule A for our tax rate bylaw in 2021. The first two sections outline our education requisition, and that is from the province based on our equalized assessments. So in this case, our total education requisition was 24.5 million, and ASFF is the Alberta School Foundation Fund, and then the opt-out school boards, that's the Medicine Hat Catholic School Board. So each of those categories, based on the applicable assessment and the tax levy that is required, will determine the tax rate for the school requisition. The next management body requisition is what has been requisitioned by the Cypress View Foundation, and that's for their outstanding operating costs. So there is a bylaw that has been passed to collect for that additional requisition, and that is shared between Cypress County, Red Cliff, and Medicine Hat based on our equalized assessment. Designated industrial property requisition, that is only sent to those that fall under that DI property type, and that's requisition comes from the province for them to prepare those assessments. And the last section is what our city council is most interested in as far as what the required applicable assessment is and what the different assessment classes are within each of those categories, whether it be single-family, multifamily, farmland, or non-residential. And in this case, machinery equipment has a zero tax rate, and so zero tax dollars are collected from that. One of the standards from the Municipal Government Act is that the tax ratio between single-family and non-residential be no greater than a 5-to-1 ratio, and currently within Medicine Hat, we have a 2.25 ratio. That provincial education requisition is the amount of taxes that is needed for education. And right now, it's less than 25% of our property tax amount shown on our assessment notice. Who pays this tax? Essentially, all property owners pay the tax, unless they are fully exempt from school. In that case, it's just mostly the provincial properties that will be exempt. So we all pay for the education tax, no matter if our property is residential or non-residential, if we have children in school or not, or if we're a senior citizen. So I hope that's given you a bit of an explanation on assessment, assigning a dollar value to the property, whether based on market value or regulated value, and the difference between the two. Assessing property based on mass appraisal using 3 approaches to the valuation. Then determining whether property is exempt or taxable or non-assessable. The valuation date being important of July 1st of the previous year, and our condition date of December 31st. And then you can really see that taxation is really a separate function from assessment, being that the municipal budget is determined by council. Education requisitions come from the province. Managing body requisitions, that comes currently from the Cypress View Foundation. And a mill rate or a tax rate is a mechanism to really distribute that tax burden evenly or fairly amongst our property owners. I thank you for your time, and if you have any questions.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions for, Councillor Dumanowski?
Your Worship, I don't have any specific questions. I do have one. I mean, I've sat through this presentation a number of times. First of all, I want to thank Sue and department for putting the presentation forward. It's a difficult department to work with, not the people, and not to suggest that the public are difficult, but it's a tough one because one thing is for certain, nobody wants to pay taxes, but that burden, that opportunity is there for all of us, and it gives us the opportunities that a community like ours can enjoy after the fact. But I'm not here to sing a song of happiness about assessment, but I do want to recognize that it is a challenge, and one of the equal challenges, and certainly that's why you're here today, is the committee felt it prudent to have you come and speak to the public. There are people who watch council, many of whom are here today, and many in TV land who want to take an interest and can look back at this and make sense of it. It can be confusing and challenging. It's not intended to be so. A couple of things before I get to one small question. One of the things that, or some of the main things that I think people forget, is that assessment is regulated by municipal affairs. So as has been explained numerous times, the rules and regulations, the playbook, if you will, is guided by the province. And we are required to do follow those requirements in the end. And one of the challenges that we've faced in the past, and I bring it up because it's important for people to know, is when there's an interest in the public or there's confusion, or in one year there were quite a few. We at one point even brought municipal affairs here to this very council, to that podium, to talk to the public, to help them understand the regulations. My main points are around some of the points you brought up, which is, you call it RFI. I've never heard it, RFI is how I've always referred to it, but the request for information is one of the things that, if I were to distill this down to some main things, whether you're a residential, non-residential taxpayer, when you get your RFI or request for information, fill it out, be honest, be fair. In the end, it actually helps you. It doesn't hurt you. One of the biggest misnomers I think I've gleaned in all my time here is this idea of market value. What does that mean? And of course, everybody wants their value to be assessed low when it comes to taxation, but they want their value to be high when it comes to sales, and so they get the most out of it. But it is defined as has been said, willing buyer, willing seller, mass market appraisal, etc. So of all of this, first of all, I just want to recognize the challenges that your department has. I do appreciate you taking the time to equally apprise the people, the public, that there are many, many steps they can take to defend or challenge, whatever you want to call it, their assessment. There's 60-day period, the LARB, the card permit, and that there is the opportunity to, even if they so wish, at some point to take it to the Court of Queen's Bench. So many mechanisms to challenge. I'm happy to hear, and maybe that'll be the first question. My sense is that the number of hearings, I know it can go up and down, and it can be based on a number of things, but my sense is that we've, through education, through the opportunities that people have to go directly to your department, directly to people like you, and get the information clarified and unpacked, that we are seeing fewer, is that fair to say, assessment reviews or challenges to the assessment review?
Through the chair. There is a fluctuation in the number of appeals that are filed. I think the highest number that we had back in 2013 was around 150, but we fluctuate around between 30 to 50 appeals each year, so that's around typical.
And how many go out each year?
How many
assessment
notices? Just over 29,000.
Okay, pretty good ratio. The last thing I wanted to talk about is the ratio of non-residential, residential. I know we typically have had lots of even very specific debates or conversations about that, and certainly we try to model ourselves after ourselves, because it's difficult to compare two communities, but we've been working hard to strike that fair balance. You mentioned a ratio of 5-to-1 is the maximum, I believe you said. So when you say that, 2.25 sounds really good, and it is fair, but do you have any thoughts on where we've trended or where we've trended relative to our peers?
That's information that we bring forward to council for you to observe during the tax rate bylaw. So you'll be seeing that come April. So we'll give the information as far as historically, what have those ratios been at, and how do we fit in relationship to other municipalities within Alberta?
Good answer. Thank you, Sue.
I think that Managing Director Egert had wanted to touch on something that you said.
So through the chair to Councillor Dumanowski, and I am looking at last year's ratio. So as it relates to non-residential tax rates compared to residential, the high point for City of Medicine was back in 2008 when that ratio was 3.16. Since then, we've been seeing a downward trend since that time. Last year was 2.25. So a slight increase from the year before, but I would categorize that as a downward trend from 2008. When we look at municipalities that we compared to last year, and we'll do something similar this year as well, I'll just list them here. Lethbridge, Airdrie, Strathcona County, Wood Buffalo, Red Deer, Grand Prairie. So that'll give you a flavor of the type of municipalities that we compare. Everyone has their own story, and everyone has their own mix of residential and non-residential, and what really drives that community. So that needs to be taken into account when we compare communities to each other. Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Van Dyke?
Yes, thank you. Councillor Dumanowski asked part of my question, which was how many assessment appeals we typically have in a year. But further to that, is there kind of a trend? Are they based on similar reasons, or is it just kind of all over for the reasons for the appeals?
Through the chair. Normally, we have a lower number of residential properties under appeal, anywhere 3 to 5. The non-residential multifamily, it could be for varying reasons. When I had talked about the income approach, 6% of our properties are based on the income approach for non-residential multifamily. However, they make up 40% of our revenue. And so that's what's at risk for appeal are the income approach properties. And when those are based on the RFI or the assessment request for information that goes out, we would appreciate council's support to have property owners fill out that request for information so that we can get the most accurate values and numbers so that we can be able to justify and support those assessments before an appeal board, because that's what's going to help us and provide us with the most accurate assessment. Currently, our return for the RFI is between 58 to 62% return.
Councillor Canodal?
Through the chair, thanks. So I have a couple different questions, and if you don't mind, we'll just ask them back and forth. So the first one is, and thank you for being here, Sue. It's awesome to have you. Your knowledge is appreciated. What is the most common issue or misunderstanding about assessment that you hear from the community?
That is a good question. I think most property owners want to make sure that we have the correct information on their assessment. So a common misunderstanding, a lot of property owners will say, well, my basement's not finished, so you can't assess my basement if there's maybe 1 or 2 baseboards that are missing. So a lot of times it will be information and education that we would like to provide to the property owner to say, what is the value of your property? How would that sell in the marketplace? So we do want to provide the best and most accurate information for the property owner, and the assessors love to have that time just to sit down with the property owner, whether it be over the phone, at the counter, or at their property, just to go over the details to make sure that we have it correct. And the most accurate way to do that is to have that dialogue with the individual. And as I said, the property or the assessor does have the ability to enter into and inspect property, and that way they can have the most accurate record of what inventory is on that property.
Thank you. Is community housing exempt from this collection, just the same as dorms at the college?
The dorms at the college are taxable, as well as the community housing. So both are assessable and taxable.
2 more. How frequently does the provincial government change the percentage required to pay to education?
Through the chair, the education requisition is a yearly requisition based on our equalized. So that's based on our previous year's assessment. And with that ratio, it's a calculation that they use. When we have to be at 100% of market value, if our ratio is at 98%, they'll apply that to our assessment base against every municipality, depending on what their ratio is, to bring them all to 100%. And then based on whatever their budget is for the education divided by the equalized assessment. That's what the value requisition will be for each municipality. So that is done on a yearly basis. So that can fluctuate. Some years we've seen 4% increase in education requisition, or it could be, anywhere from 2 to 4% or more. And that's going to depend on what happens with our assessment base and our ratios as well. So there's a lot of different factors that can influence that.
I think I'll be done. Thank you. I appreciate your time.
Councillor Robbins?
Through the chair, hi Sue. My questions are much like Councillor Canola's, they're more curiosity. I think your presentation was very informative and thorough, so I understand it as much as I can without further training in being an assessor, which is maybe not the career for me. But my first question is about assessors. Are all of the assessors in the department cross-trained to do this income assessment or market modified, or do you specialize in them?
Through the chair, in a smaller municipality, we have the ability to be able to do more cross-training, but it does take time to train the assessors. So our new assessors coming in predominantly will begin with residential properties, with the philosophy that's sometimes an easier place to start, evaluating properties, and then once they progress, they will do assessments of other properties. So when we have a staff of 12 assessors, and if we've got, in the past, we've had numerous retirements because we had a staff that had been here for several years. So the cross-training is beneficial for the stability of the department and to make sure that we can have our succession planning so that we can provide that education and have more stability with our assessments.
Great, thank you. And I have a question about page 43 of your slides. Maybe it's not labeled that way for you. Sorry, it would be a different slide number. It doesn't matter. Asset specifically. And you had mentioned that if it's not within 5%, so this is the quality control of municipal affairs, right? So if it's not within 5% one way or the other, then you're not meeting the quality control requirement. Is there a consequence to that, is my question?
We just can't declare. So what we have to do is we go back, we work through our assessments to make sure that our assessments are meeting that value. So that's where, in some years, you may find that some assessments are increasing more than others, and that's in order to meet that ratio. If we've got sales that are higher and our assessments are too low, we need to move up our assessment value so that the gap is not too great. So we have to be within that 5% to meet our those standards.
And if you're not, you get more homework from municipal affairs, is what I'm understanding?
That is correct. So
Okay.
we'll go through the first audit, and then they will do a more detailed audit after we declare. And if there's issues, they will have us fix that for the next year.
And you mentioned something very early on which really piqued my interest. You talked about section 294, I believe, allowing an assessor the ability to access a home to inspect or to make the assessment, like physically make the assessment. So my question is, how often is that necessary? And did COVID affect the way that process happened?
Through the chair, yes, it did affect. We do have, if we're looking at residential properties, and our aim is to look at 1/5 of our properties every 5 years, so 20% of our properties every 5 years. If we're looking at certain neighborhoods, in order to get the most accurate information would be to have an interior inspection. If we're not able to do that with property owners, we do send out surveys for them to have a hand in responding and providing the information. And the assessors will also drive by, could be information through MLS and sorry, what was the other part to that?
I just wondered how often that happened, and if COVID affected whether that took place for the last 2 years.
Thank you. I apologize. Yeah, so we did provide property owners during COVID with other options. If they were not comfortable with an assessor in the home, that was no problem. They could do an interview at the door or over the phone. They could also provide pictures and videos through email. So we really did want to provide options for property owners so that we could still get the accurate information.
Councillor Hirsch?
Thanks, Your Worship. Sue, I didn't see you on the last go-around on corporate, but I've been through a lot of your presentations before as well, so thank you for that. And, you know, in my travels, I talked to many different people, and some business owners, quite frankly, that when we talk inevitably, well, I'll back up a second, you talk about COVID, so they're looking at every line item in their budget. And inevitably, it comes back to a discussion that there's a feeling within the business community that they subsidize residential rates. And when I got elected, it was whatever the ratio was at, I just tried to work towards reduction, and we've had this conversation before. But going back a little bit, and maybe you can help, and maybe you might be able to, you might plead the fifth in terms of how the originations of the discrepancy occurred, but I mean, I think there's a noticeable attempt for us to drive it down. But was there, or, you know, and I know we compare ourselves to other municipalities, but I'm just intrigued by the fact that there is a difference in that. And maybe it might be because the population of the businesses are by volume are way smaller than the larger. But just maybe some feedback on that, because I just feel inadequate when I get that charge leveled at me. And all I can say is I'm trying to do my best to lower it. But, you know, it was always a bugaboo for me in terms of how that originated.
Through the chair. So just to clarify, you're looking for more information on the ratio between non-residential and single family and why the difference of,
Yeah.
say, back in 2008, it was at a higher level?
Well, that or the discrepancy in general. I know we had a previous counselor here that would all try to drive the idea of a one-to-one and to get there. But being a zero-sum game, that equates to residential having a massive potentially increase to their taxes to counteract. But I guess I'm just wondering if there's the originations, if there was some discussion in terms of how we got there. It is prevalent without the community. Within every community, we see where we rank, and I appreciate that, because of course, it's almost every year we get the inevitable conversation with the Chamber of Commerce talking about that ratio as well. And I think, you know, I'm pretty pleased of the progress that we made, but just some indication of, and it might have predated you, just some historical stuff to just respond to a business owner that charges that at me.
Through the chair. What I can do is provide you with information on assessment, and then council will have to make that decision as far as what that ratio will be. But my observations with ratios that were higher in the past is when our assessments were lower, say for non-residential prior to 2013. If our assessments were lower, then that's when that gap was higher, that tax ratio, because then the tax rate was at a higher level in order to meet that whatever tax revenue you want to generate from non-residential. It's going to be for different reasons. If we look at Calgary, their ratio was up to 4-to-1 in the past years, and that's been coming down, but then the burden shifts to the residential property owners. So it's going to be for different reasons for different property municipalities, depending on their mix of non-residential and residential and what their market values are doing.
That's a good answer. Thank you.
I think Acting City Manager Mastel has something to add as well.
Thanks, Your Worship. Through the chair to Councillor Hirsch. There was a pretty in-depth examination conducted in the last 2 years that I think we could refresh and bring back as part of the tax rate setting discussion, just to give a little bit more insight on that particular question. The one thing that I recall that we learned as we looked at peer groups and examined it is it very much does reflect each municipality's unique circumstances. So within the $8 billion of assessment base in the city of Medicine Hat, that composition looks quite different here than it does in a number of peer municipalities. And so that gives rise to different ratios like that. So it's an indicator, but where it landed with the previous council was it didn't find its way into a policy position that would say this would be the right rate. It needs to be looked at each year in the tax rate setting methodology, the exercise, and as part of that, Managing Director Eggert said that there will be a peer comparison available for council to look at and see what's happening in other municipalities, but we can also describe the factors of consideration that we uncovered as we went through that exercise as well. So that might be a good undertaking for us to bring back in a couple months' time.
So in just supplemental and maybe in support or defense or otherwise, I, in my travels, had conversations with the town of Chestermere, for example, a bedroom community of Calgary, and their industry/business was really low because for the most part, it was more residential. So they're begging for more business to come to town to be able to kind of share that wealth. So, you know, I guess my point is I appreciate the fact that we kind of look at other municipalities, but that is kind of almost a little bit orange apple. It's still a fruit, I get it, but, you know, you don't know the composition of that municipality in terms of the number of businesses relative to residents, et cetera. And again, I appreciate the fact that, you know, again, I want to reiterate that it was a movement of this council and previous councils, and I can't speak for this one because haven't got our strategic plan put together yet, but it was a goal to have that ratio lowered a little bit. So I like the trajectory we're on. So thank you.
All right, seeing no more questions, thank you so much, Sue. That was wonderful.
Thank you for the opportunity. And I'll be speaking to you again here once we send out the notices, just to give you an idea what the results were going from last year to this year.